Hey, everybody. In chapters 29, 30, and 31, the novel finally comes to an end. Each of these three chapters stands as a short chapter, and they work together to finalize the story. So in chapter 29, Boo Radley is finally introduced and described. In chapter 30, we get the description of the assault on the children and the aftermath of it, and what led up to Bob Ewell's death. And then in 31, we get the poignant walk home where Scout finally gets the chance to experience the world through Boo Radley's eyes. So starting with chapter 29, we get the first part of the description of what happened under the tree. And Scout again recounts the fact that they thought that Cecil Jacobs was following them home. They yelled back at him. Hecate asked Atticus if he heard the yelling. He said, no, I had the radio on. Most of the neighbors would have had their radio on too. But this is the first idea that Boo Radley was the one that helped the children, because Boo Radley would not have had a radio on, and Boo Radley was closest to the assault. And so the beginnings of the story of Boo's participation in all of this starts to come out there. And so Scout and Atticus go on to explain to the sheriff that Scout's costume had made it difficult for her to see what was going on, but then the sheriff also picks up the costume and says this probably saved her life. I quote, Mr. Tate rubbed his chin. I wondered why he had those marks on him. His sleeves were perforated with little holes. They were the one or two little puncture marks on his arm to match the holes. Let me see that thing, will you, sir? So he's talking about Bob Ewell having little puncture marks all over his arms from the chicken wire. And then he goes on to say, he pointed with a long forefinger. Before that. Atticus fetched the remains of the costume. Mr. Tate turned it over and bent it around to get an idea of its former shape. This thing probably saved her life, he said. Look. He pointed with a long forefinger. A shiny, clean line stood out on the dull wire. Bob Ewell meant business, Mr. Tate muttered. So what he's pointing at is a place where the knife that Bob Ewell had was like stabbed into the costume, but because Scout had the costume on, it didn't allow the knife to reach her body. And so again, the idea that this costume prevented Bob Ewell from squeezing her so hard, but also prevented him from stabbing her. The idea that the sheriff said he meant business. He meant to kill these children. It wasn't just trying to beat them up, wasn't trying to scare them. He was out to kill the children. Scout goes on to again, in a fairly detailed way, explain the incidents under the tree in a very similar way to they were explained in the previous chapter. So Scout says, then all of a sudden something grabbed me and mashed my costume. Think I ducked on the ground. Heard a tussling under the tree, sort of. They were bamming around against the trunk. Sounded like Jim found me and started pulling me toward the road. Mr. Ewell yanked him down, I reckon. They tussled some more, and then there was this funny noise. Jim hollered. I stopped. That was Jim's arm. Anyway, Jim hollered, and I didn't hear him anymore, and the next thing Mr. Ewell was trying to squeeze me to death. I reckon. Then somebody yanked Mr. Ewell down. Jim must have got up. I guess that's all I know. And then, Mr. Tate, looking at me sharply, somebody was staggering around and panting and coughing, fit to die. I thought it was Jim at first, but it didn't sound like him. So I went looking for Jim on the ground. I thought Atticus had come to help us and had got worn out. So the coughing, staggering man is Boo Radley, who has just stabbed Bob Ewell and is now wheezing. And in the following chapter, he wheezes again when he's talking to Scout and coughs into a handkerchief. So the sheriff said, who was it that was staggering around? Who was it that carried Jim home? And this is when we finally meet Boo Radley. So in the last paragraph of chapter 29, quoting from the book, when I pointed to him, his palm slipped slightly, leaving greasy sweat streaks on the wall, and he hooked his thumbs in his belt. A strange, small spasm shook him, as if he heard fingernails scrape slate. But as I gazed at him in wonder, the tension slowly drained from his face. His lips parted into a timid smile, and our neighbor's image blurred with my sudden tears. Hey, Boo, I said. So Scout has finally met Boo Radley, and looking at him, the curtain comes down between the two of them. Boo Radley smiles at Scout, and Scout looks at Boo Radley and suddenly starts tearing up because she's finally met this man, and she greets him by saying, "Hey, Boo." So then in chapter 30, we start talking about the crime, and Scout had mentioned that she thought Jim was the one that yanked Bob Ewell off of her, and the sheriff doesn't feel that that happened. And there's always debate with students about exactly what's going on in this chapter and exactly what happened under the tree. And that debate is fueled by the fact that Heck Tate 3 or 4 times in the chapter says, no, Bob Ewell fell on his knife. What the sheriff is doing is concocting a story and trying to convince Atticus that he should go along with this story. But even though Heck Tate is saying Bob Ewell fell on his knife, he continues to also point out to Atticus what really happened and why it's important to not tell the town what really happened. So initially Atticus thinks that Jim killed Bob Ewell. And he's talking about how he refuses to cover it up because he doesn't want the town talking about Jim in a very similar way to the way the town has talked about Boo all these years. He wants to get it out in the open, he wants to come clean with it, and he wants Jim to be able to go on with his life. And the sheriff keeps saying, no, you can't do that. We can't let this happen. So, as Heck Tate makes his case, he says, "Heck," Atticus' back was turned, "if this thing's hushed up, it'll be a simple denial to Jim of the way I've tried to raise him. Sometimes I think I'm a total failure as a parent, but I'm all they've got. Before Jim looks at anyone else, he looks at me, and I've tried to live so I can look squarely back at him. If I convinced at something like this, frankly, I couldn't meet his eye, and the day I can't do that, I'll know I've lost him. I don't want to lose him and Scout, because they're all I've got." And so this is the Atticus that was saying, we can't hush this up. We have to make it clean in a very similar way to the way that he described why he had to take the case with Tom Robinson, that it's the right thing to do, it's the moral thing to do. And so now Heck Tate is going to convince Atticus that it wasn't Jim that killed Bob Ewell, and that it was Boo, and that we need to keep this quiet for the town because Boo couldn't take this kind of attention. So Heck begins to explain what he's talking about. Mr. Tate added that Atticus wasn't going to stand there and maintain that any boy Jim's size with a busted arm had fight enough left in him to tackle and kill a grown man in the pitch dark. So this is a really important point. You've got a grown man in Bob Ewell. You have you have Jim at this point with a broken arm, and the sheriff is saying a small boy with a broken arm couldn't yank a grown man off of your daughter. And so he then goes on. "Heck," said Atticus abruptly, "that was a switchblade you were waving. Where'd you get it?" "Took it off a drunk man," Mr. Tate answered coolly. So Heck Tate is describing the crime that he's going to tell the town about, and he pulls a switchblade out of his pocket, and he opens it up, and he shows how Bob Ewell could have stumbled forward and stabbed himself with this switchblade. Atticus says, "Where'd you get the switchblade?" And he says coolly, "I took it off a drunk man." So the implication there is that when Heck Tate first encounters the body of Bob Ewell underneath the tree, he's got a kitchen knife stabbed up underneath his ribs, but he has a switchblade on him, a drunk man, meaning Bob Ewell. The sheriff takes the switchblade off of Bob Ewell's body, puts it in his pocket, and leaves only the kitchen knife still sticking into Bob Ewell. So this is the beginning of the sheriff's cover-up of this whole thing. "I was trying to remember. Mr. Ewell was on me. Then he went down. Jim must have gotten up. At least I thought." "Heck, I said I took it off a drunk man downtown tonight. Ewell probably found that kitchen knife in the dump somewhere, honed it down, and bided his time." Just bided his time. Atticus made his way to the swing and sat down, his hands dangling limply between his knees. He was looking at the floor. He had moved with the same slowness that night in front of the jail, when I thought it took him forever to fold his newspaper and toss it in his chair. Mr. Tate clumped softly around the porch. "It ain't your decision, Mr. Finch. It's all mine. It's my decision and my responsibility. For once, if you don't see it my way, there's not much you can do about it. If you want to try, I'll call you a liar to your face." Your boy never stabbed Bob Ewell, he said slowly. Didn't come near a mile of it, and now you know it. All he wanted to do was get him and his sister home safely. Mr. Tate stopped pacing. He stopped in front of Atticus, and his back was to me. I'm not a very good man, sir, but I am sheriff of Macomb County. Lived in this town all my life, and I'm going on 43 years old. Know everything that's happened here since before I was born. There's a black boy dead for no reason, and the man responsible for it's dead. Let the dead bury the dead this time, Mr. Finch. Let the dead bury the dead. Mr. Tate went to the swing and picked up his hat. It was lying beside Atticus. Mr. Tate pushed back his hair and put his hat on. I never heard tell that it's against the law for a citizen to do his utmost to prevent a crime from being committed, which is exactly what he did. But maybe you'll say it's my duty to tell the town all about it and not hush it up. Know what had happened then? All the ladies in Macomb, including my wife, would be knocking on his door, bringing angel food cake. To my way of thinking, Mr. Finch, taking the one man who's done you and this town a great service and dragging him with his shy ways into the limelight, to me, that's a sin. It's a sin, and I'm not about to have it on my head. If it was any other man, it'd be different, but not this man, Mr. Finch. So Heck Tate there is saying, look, Boo Radley helped you out. Boo Radley defended your children and killed Bob Ewell. But we can't tell the town about it because they're going to come all over Boo and pull him into the limelight. And a man as shy as Boo Radley couldn't take that kind of limelight and attention. Mr. Tate was trying to dig a hole in the floor with the toe of his boot. He pulled his nose, then he massaged his left arm. I may not be much, Mr. Finch, but I'm still sheriff of Macomb County, and Bob Ewell fell on his knife. Good night, sir. Mr. Tate stamped off the porch and strode across the front yard. His car door slammed and he drove away. Atticus sat looking at the floor for a long time. Finally, he raised his head. Scout, he said. Mr. Ewell fell on his knife. Can you possibly understand? Atticus looked like he needed cheering up. I ran to him and hugged him and kissed him with all my might. Yes, sir, I understand, I reassured him. Mr. Tate was right. Atticus disengaged himself and looked at me. What do you mean? Well, it'd be sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it? Atticus put his face in my hair and rubbed it. When he got up and walked across the porch into the shadows, his youthful step had returned. Before he went inside the house, he stopped in front of Boo Radley. Thank you for my children, Arthur, he said. So in those last few paragraphs, you've got Atticus finally coming to terms with the idea that they need to cover up what Boo Radley did. They need to stick with this story that Bob Ewell fell on his knife. Then he looks at Scout and he says, look, I know I'm lying, but can you understand why I'm lying? And Scout looks at Atticus and says, yes, of course I can understand why you're lying. We can't do this to Boo Radley. He only helped us out. We need to just simply let Bob Ewell be dead and let this awful death of Tom Robinson be avenged and be done with it. And then the last indication that Atticus is now convinced that Boo Radley saved his children and that this story is the way they need to go with it, is that he goes to Boo Radley and thanks him for saving his children. So then we move into chapter 31, and chapter 31 is this poignant description of Scout walking Boo Radley home. And this is when she turns on the porch and finally understands Boo Radley because she's walking in his shoes. Really some of the finest writing ever done. So beginning near the end of the chapter, she says, neighbors bring food with death and flowers with sickness and little things in between. Boo was our neighbor. He gave us 2 soap dolls, a broken watch and chain, a pair of good luck pennies, and our lives. But neighbors give in return. We never put back into the tree what we took out of it. We had given him nothing, and it made me sad. So their Scout is acknowledging that Boo Radley not only gave them these little gifts and things earlier in the novel, but he also saved their life under the tree. I turned to go home. Streetlights winked down the street, all the way to town. I had never seen our neighborhood from this angle, meaning Boo Radley's angle. There were Miss Maudie's, Miss Stephanie's, and there was our house. I could see the porch swing. Miss Rachel's house was beyond us. plainly visible. I could even see Mrs. DeBose's. I looked behind me. To the left of the brown door was a long shuttered window. I walked to it, stood in front of it, and turned around. In daylight, I thought, you could see the post office corner. Daylight. In my mind, the night faded. It was daytime, and the neighborhood was busy. Miss Stephanie Crawford crossed the street to tell the latest to Miss Rachel. Miss Maudie bent over her azaleas. It was summertime, and 2 children scampered down the sidewalk toward a man approaching in the distance. The man waved, and the children raced each other to him. So there's the description of Atticus coming home from his office, and Scout and Jim running up to greet him. It was still summertime, and the children came closer. A boy trudged down the sidewalk, dragging a fishing pole behind him. A man stood waiting with his hands on his hips. Summertime, and his children played in the front yard with their friend, enacting a strange little drama of their own invention. So that's the description of Dill and Jim and Scout acting out the Boo Radley skit. It was fall, and his children fought on the sidewalk in front of Miss DeBose's. The boy helped his sister to her feet, and they made their way home. Fall, and his children totted to and fro around the corner, the day's woes and triumphs on their faces. They stopped at an oak tree, delighted, puzzled, apprehensive. So there we have a description of Jim attacking Mrs. DeBose's azaleas, and we also have the description of the children looking delighted, puzzled, and apprehensive as they accept the gifts out of the tree that Boo Radley has left them there. Winter and his children shivered at the front gate, silhouetted against a blazing house. Winter and a man walked into the street, dropped his glasses, and shot a dog. So there's the description of Ms. Maudie's house burning down, and the description of Atticus killing the rabid dog, who, if you remember, is the symbol of racism. Summer, and he watched his children's heartbreak. Autumn again, and Boo's children needed him. So summer, and he watched his children's heartbreak, is when Tom Robinson was convicted of the crime that he did not commit. And that's when Jim especially was so distraught by the fact that these townspeople could perpetrate a miscarriage of justice in such a manner. Atticus was right. One time he said, you never really know a man until you stand in his shoes and walk around in them. Just standing on the Radley porch was enough. So there Scout is saying, I stood on this porch, I looked at what happened in our neighborhood through his eyes, and I finally came to understand who Boo Radley was. And then we get the last sentences of the book that are, again, so brilliantly written. He guided me to the bed and sat me down. He lifted my legs and put me under the cover. This is Atticus putting Scout to bed. And they chased him and never could catch him because they didn't know what he looked like. And Atticus, when they finally saw him, why, he hadn't done any of those things. Atticus, he was real nice. So what's happening there is Scout is half asleep, and she's sort of mixing up the plot of the story, The Gray Ghost, that Atticus had just been telling her, and sort of mixing it up with also her meeting of Boo Radley. And so that pronouncement, he was real nice, is Scout talking about Boo Radley. His hands were under my chin, pulling up the cover, tucking it around me. Most people are, Scout, when you finally see them. He turned out the light and went into Jim's room. He would be there all night, and he would be there when Jim woke up in the morning. So this is as close as we can get to a happy ending to a somewhat tragic novel. But you have this ending where Scout and Jim are safe. And they have also learned so much about the town and about the way racism works. The indication is that they're going to go into adulthood as really thoughtful, fully functioning human beings. And the fact that the adult Scout can tell such a compelling story gives you the idea that Atticus has done an amazing job raising these children. The happy ending comes from the fact that they're going to go forth and do great things in their lives. So we have the ending of the book, we have the resolution of Bob Ewell being killed in in retribution for attacking the children, but also in retribution for falsely accusing Tom Robinson. And so there's a cyclical kind of nature to all of this, and it all comes to a poignant end. I hope this has helped. As I normally say, if you have any questions, see me in class or email me. Thank you very much.